Hello everyone, welcome to DeepSight. Today, we are going to explore a fascinating historical period, the Age of Discovery. From the late 15th century to the early 17th century, European countries engaged in maritime exploration, geographic discoveries, and colonial activities, which had profound impacts on global geography, economy, and culture. Let's take a look back at this exciting era. The Age of Discovery, also known as the Age of Exploration, is a significant historical period from the late 15th century to the early 17th century. This era witnessed European countries exploring and colonizing new lands, which deeply influenced global geography, economy, and culture. Why is this period so important? Let's delve into its causes, processes, and outcomes. First, let's examine the world situation at the end of the Middle Ages. In Europe, significant changes occurred in the social and economic structures. The Renaissance brought about the liberation of thought and progress in science and technology. The Reformation triggered the desire for religious freedom, and the rise of nation-states spurred economic development. For example, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa accumulated considerable wealth through Mediterranean trade, inspiring other nations to pursue trade interests. Behind these changes lay the competition and conflict among European nations. These countries sought to dominate the international stage by constantly exploring and expanding their territories. Meanwhile, in the East, the Ming dynasty under Zheng He conducted a series of maritime explorations, showcasing their formidable seafaring capabilities. Zheng He's 7 voyages to the Western Ocean reached Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the east coast of Africa, leading to substantial material and cultural exchanges. However, the Ming dynasty later became more isolated, reducing external contacts and providing opportunities for Western maritime exploration. As Europe's economy developed and the demand for luxury goods such as spices, silk, and gold increased, European countries sought new sea routes to Asia to bypass Muslim intermediaries. Establishing maritime routes not only reduced trade costs, but also allowed direct access to wealth. This economic motivation was a significant driver of the Age of Discovery. At the time, spices were particularly precious, used not only for seasoning but also for food preservation and medicine. Because land routes were controlled by intermediaries, prices were high and supplies were unstable, prompting European nations to find new routes to obtain these valuable commodities directly. The rise of Mongol and later Ottoman empires in Asia profoundly impacted trade. The Mongol Empire established secure trade routes, enhancing the prosperity of the Silk Road and increasing east-west exchanges. However, as the Mongol Empire declined, these trade routes became unsafe, reducing trade. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, controlling key maritime routes in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, further strengthened east-west trade. The Ottomans' control of these crucial trade hubs significantly impacted European commodity flows, forcing European countries to seek new routes to free themselves from Ottoman dependency. The desire to spread Christianity was another important motivation for maritime exploration. Churches and monarchs hoped to spread Christianity to undiscovered regions, expanding religious influence. In these explorations, religious and political motivations were often intertwined, with religious propagation symbolizing the extension of national power. Technological innovation was key to the success of the Age of Discovery. New ship designs, such as the caravel, made long voyages possible. These ships were light yet sturdy, capable of carrying heavy loads. Their multi-mast design enabled them to cope with changing wind directions, increasing sailing efficiency and safety. Besides ship improvements, advancements in navigational instruments were crucial. The use of compasses allowed sailors to determine direction at sea, while astrolabes and cross staffs helped navigators determine latitude by observing stars. The combination of these instruments greatly improved the feasibility and accuracy of long-distance voyages. Additionally, advancements in shipbuilding technology made vessels more robust and durable, capable of withstanding extended sea voyages. Maritime technology innovation was not limited to Europe. In China, Zheng He's treasure ships were also outstanding examples of seafaring technology. Zheng He's fleet was large and well-equipped, demonstrating China's leading position in maritime technology. The Age of Discovery is often credited to several key explorers and nations. Among the first to start this era were the Portuguese, particularly Vasco da Gama, who completed a voyage from Europe to India between 1497 and 1499, opening a new route for East India trade. Bartolomeu Dias set sail from Lisbon, Portugal in August 1487, heading south along the west coast of Africa. His fleet sailed along the coast, enduring storms and unknown waters. In 1488, he successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, becoming the first European to reach the southern tip of Africa. Dias's voyage aimed to find a new route to India to obtain spices and other valuable commodities, funded mainly by the Portuguese royal family. Despite insufficient supplies and exhausted crew members prompting his return, his journey paved the way for future explorers. Vasco da Gama set out on July 8, 1497, from Lisbon, sailing south along the west coast of Africa. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, he continued north, advancing along the east coast of Africa. In Malindi, Kenya, he hired an experienced Arab navigator who guided him across the Indian Ocean. On May 20, 1498, da Gama reached Calicut, India, becoming the first navigator to establish a sea route from Europe to India. His goal was to establish a direct spice trade route, funded mainly by the Portuguese royal family. His discovery brought immense wealth to Portugal and opened direct trade between Europe and Asia. Portuguese success greatly inspired Spanish exploration. In the late 15th century, the Portuguese had acquired significant wealth and status by developing new routes and discovering new lands. This encouraged the Spanish kingdom to join the competition for exploration and trade. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, funded by the Spanish monarchs, crossed the Atlantic. Columbus's first voyage began on August 3, 1492, with 3 ships, Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina, departing from Palos, Spain, and heading west across the Atlantic. After passing the Canary Islands, they continued westward. After months of sailing, they landed in the present-day Bahamas on October 12, 1492, discovering the New World. Columbus continued to explore the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola. Columbus's mission was to find a westward route to Asia to acquire valuable spices and gold. He believed that by sailing west, he could reach Asia and bypass the land routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire. His funding mainly came from the Spanish crown, with support from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Columbus's voyage proved that new lands could be reached by sailing west, though he believed he had reached Asia. His discovery triggered subsequent waves of colonization, changing the course of American history. 20 years later, another Spanish navigator took the Age of Discovery to new heights, Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan's circumnavigation began on September 20, 1519, with 5 ships, San Antonio, Concepcion, Santiago, Trinidad, and Victoria, departing from Sanlúcar de Barrameda, Spain, first heading south across the Atlantic. During their journey, they crossed the equator and continued south, reaching the east coast of South America. Magellan sailed along the South American coast, searching for a passage to the Pacific. In October 1520, they finally found a narrow waterway at the southern tip of South America, now known as the Strait of Magellan. After crossing the Strait of Magellan, they entered the vast Pacific Ocean, marking the first human crossing of the Pacific. Magellan's fleet sailed across the Pacific for months, enduring extreme hunger and disease. Eventually, they reached the Philippines, where Magellan was killed in a local conflict. Despite losing their commander, Magellan's fleet continued their journey, crossing the Indian Ocean, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and finally returning to Spain on September 6, 1522, completing the first circumnavigation. Magellan's mission was to find a westward route to the Spice Islands and prove the Earth was round, funded mainly by the Spanish crown. His discovery completed the first circumnavigation, proving the Earth's vastness and connectivity, with profound impacts on geography and navigation. In fact, the idea that the Earth is round was proposed in ancient Greece, but was not widely accepted due to limited scientific and observational tools at the time. In the 16th century, Nicholas Copernicus proposed the heliocentric theory, reaffirming that the Earth is round and orbits the Sun. This theory gradually gained support and confirmation, providing the theoretical basis for navigating the globe from both west and east. Both Copernicus and Magellan played key roles in confirming that the Earth is round, but their contributions differed. Copernicus, a 16th-century Polish astronomer, was born in 1473, while Magellan was born in 1480. Copernicus's heliocentric theory, which posited the Sun at the center of the universe, challenged both scientific and religious doctrines of the time. Despite not directly proving that the Earth is round, his theory laid a scientific foundation that led many to rethink the structure of the Earth and the universe. Magellan demonstrated the vastness and interconnectedness of the Earth through practical navigation. In fact, Magellan did not witness the entire voyage firsthand. He was killed on April 27, 1521, at Mactan Island in the Philippines. At that time, his fleet was in the Philippines and had a conflict with the local chieftain Lapu-Lapu. Magellan attempted to help another chieftain conquer Lapu-Lapu's tribe, but was ultimately killed by Lapu-Lapu's forces in the battle. According to historical records, Magellan was hacked and stabbed to death by the soldiers' spears. Magellan's sacrifice marked the point at which he was unable to complete the entire circumnavigation, but his fleet continued the journey under the command of his deputy, Juan Sebastián Elcano, and eventually completed the first circumnavigation in human history. The Yangtze River's waves push forward wave upon wave, and each wave is mightier than the last. In the end, the age of exploration's ultimate victor was the British Empire. It began in the late 16th century and reached its peak during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. Let's discuss the background of Britain's entry into this arena. Firstly, with the economic prosperity brought about by the Renaissance, British merchants and nobles were eager to acquire more wealth and resources. Spices, silk, and other Oriental goods were in high demand and priced highly in European markets. Britain hoped to open new routes directly to the sources of these valuable commodities to avoid exploitation by middlemen. Secondly, after the Reformation, Britain, as a Protestant nation, aimed to expand its religious influence and spread Christianity globally. Missionaries accompanied explorers, seeking to spread the Christian faith to newly discovered lands. Thirdly, the European powers of the time, including Spain and Portugal, had already embarked on intense global competition. Britain sought to secure a position on the international stage and compete with other nations for global dominance through maritime exploration and colonial expansion. Lastly, advancements in navigation technology, such as improved ship design, development of navigational instruments, and charting, made long-distance voyages more feasible and safe. Britain's shipbuilding industry saw significant progress during this period, providing the necessary technical support for large-scale maritime exploration. Britain's early explorations were primarily focused on North America. In 1497, John Cabot, with the support of Henry VII, explored the eastern coast of North America, marking the beginning of Britain's exploration of the New World. During the era of Henry's granddaughter, Elizabeth I, prominent explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh led multiple significant voyages. Between 1577 and 1580, Drake completed a circumnavigation of the globe, demonstrating the vastness and interconnectedness of the Earth. Drake's circumnavigation began on December 13, 1577, when he led 5 ships from Plymouth, England, first crossing the Atlantic Ocean to the eastern coast of South America. After provisioning and repairs at the Strait of Magellan, Drake's fleet entered the Pacific Ocean, raiding multiple Spanish colonies and ships along the western coast of South America and seizing vast amounts of wealth. Continuing northward, Drake eventually reached the coast of California. After a brief stay, he continued westward, crossing the Pacific Ocean, passing through Indonesia and the Indian Ocean, and finally rounding the Cape of Good Hope to return to England. On September 26, 1580, Drake's fleet returned triumphantly, completing the second circumnavigation in human history. This voyage elevated Britain's understanding of the world to a new level. Drake's voyage aimed to explore new routes and plunder wealth. Funding primarily came from Queen Elizabeth I of England and private investors. The result of Drake's discoveries was the seizure of significant wealth from Spanish colonies and ships, showcasing Britain's growing maritime power and inspiring more British explorers to venture into maritime exploration and colonial activities. In 1584, Raleigh explored the eastern coast of North America and named it Virginia. Britain's age of exploration also marked the establishment of its maritime supremacy. Through a series of wars and naval confrontations, Britain gradually replaced Spain and the Netherlands to become the dominant global maritime power. In 1588, Britain defeated the Spanish Armada, cementing its dominance in European seas. In 1600, Britain extended its reach to Asia with the establishment of the East India Company, marking the official start of its trade activities in Asia. The East India Company established many trade posts in India, China, and Southeast Asia, becoming Britain's main trading entity in Asia. The East India Company, English East India Company, EIC, was not a typical company. In many ways, it resembled a colonial empire with extensive autonomous powers, featuring unique military and political structures. The East India Company had its own military, including army and navy forces. These forces conducted military operations in the Indian subcontinent and surrounding regions to protect the company's commercial interests and counter local powers and European competitors. The company's forces played crucial roles in key battles, such as the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which established British control over India. The East India Company was not merely a trading entity but also exercised considerable administrative and judicial power in its controlled territories. The company had its own officials and administrative structures to govern colonies and manage local economic affairs. In some respects, the company even had the authority to legislate and impose fines. Additionally, the company established its own monetary system, postal system, and infrastructure. In India, the company ruled through its residencies and governors, who reported directly to the company's board of directors in London. The board, elected by company shareholders, was responsible for policymaking and overseeing the company's global operations. The East India Company dominated trade in Asia, selling tea, spices, silk, and other goods, generating substantial profits for Britain. The company's activities had profound impacts on local social structures and cultures, promoting education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. The decline of the East India Company was primarily due to several factors. First, as the company expanded, it became cumbersome and inefficient, plagued by corruption and mismanagement. Second, competition from other European companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, eroded the EIC's market share. Third, as global dynamics shifted, the company remained focused on resource exploitation and low-value trades, failing to keep pace with industrialization, leading to persistent financial problems and eventual bankruptcy. The East India Company's influence waned in the early 19th century, with increasing British government control. In 1858, the British government took over the company's administration, formally ending the EIC and incorporating its territories into British India. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain established extensive colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Africa. These colonies provided Britain with abundant resources and markets, boosting the domestic economy's prosperity. Colonial activities also fostered technological and cultural exchanges, promoting interactions and integration among global civilizations. Finally, let's talk about Zheng He from China. The Ming Dynasty was the world's most powerful country at the time. Zheng He's 7 maritime expeditions demonstrated China's naval capabilities and brought significant cultural exchanges and trade. His voyages were grand in scale, carrying numerous precious gifts, comprising hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of crew members. He established friendly relations with countries along the way. This differed significantly from European maritime expeditions, which were primarily motivated by resource acquisition. Zheng He's voyages aimed to showcase the empire's might and the emperor's grandeur, emphasizing China's naval prowess and fostering trade and cultural exchanges. Funding primarily came from the Ming government. There are various theories about Zheng He's maritime expeditions. One popular anecdote suggests he was searching for the missing emperor's nephew, Jiangwen Emperor, who was overthrown by Yongle Emperor. Jiangwen Emperor, the second Ming Emperor, disappeared during the Jingnan campaign in 1402. Legend has it that he escaped and lived incognito as a monk. However, there is no conclusive historical evidence supporting this theory. Deploying such a massive fleet for a search mission would be far less efficient than sending an assassin. The Age of Exploration had profound impacts on the world today, establishing new global trade networks and promoting exchanges of goods, cultures, and technologies. European countries acquired vast resources through overseas colonies, driving domestic economic growth. The new routes ensured stable supplies of spices, silk, and gold, lowering prices and fostering European economic prosperity. This global trade network extended beyond Europe and Asia, involving the Americas and Africa. European nations obtained vast resources, such as gold and silver from the Americas and slaves from Africa, significantly driving global economic growth and integration. The new routes also stimulated Europe's commercial revolution, accelerating capital accumulation and economic expansion through banking and financial systems. The influx of wealth from the Americas, especially Spain and Portugal, due to gold and silver mining, brought immense economic benefits. This wealth not only spurred economic prosperity in these countries, but also catalyzed economic and social transformations across Europe. Additionally, crops from the Americas, such as corn, potatoes, and tobacco, enriched European diets and agricultural production. The Age of Exploration was also a period marked by somber topics. European powers established vast colonies globally, profoundly impacting local societies, economies, and cultures. These impacts were both positive, such as technological and cultural dissemination, and negative, including the oppression of indigenous peoples and resource plundering. European colonizers looted vast amounts of gold, silver, spices, and other precious resources from the Americas, Africa, and Asia, greatly boosting European economic growth but causing local economic collapse and resource depletion. Colonizers forced indigenous peoples into labor, particularly in plantations and mines, under harsh conditions, leading to high mortality rates. The Age of Exploration also witnessed the notorious transatlantic slave trade, where Europeans captured and transported millions of Africans to the Americas as slaves, subjecting them to extreme suffering and exploitation. Colonization severely damaged local cultures, destroying traditional beliefs and social structures, replacing them with European cultures and religions. European colonizers also brought diseases such as smallpox and measles, causing devastating outbreaks among indigenous populations who lacked immunity. Many indigenous communities suffered significant population declines within a short period. These acts of plunder and enslavement had long-lasting impacts on local populations, with many regions still bearing the consequences today. While the Age of Exploration initiated early globalization, it also came with a tremendous cost. The Age of Exploration enabled Europe to gradually become a global dominant force, influencing world history for centuries. The new routes and trade networks not only altered economic dynamics but also facilitated cultural and knowledge exchange. European nations amassed wealth and resources through colonization, fueling their rise and development. Exploration and discovery during this period also spurred scientific and technological progress and the dissemination of knowledge. The era of geographical discovery sparked interest in geography, astronomy, and navigational technology, promoting scientific research. For example, Copernicus's heliocentric theory, Galileo's astronomical observations, and Newton's theories of mechanics all developed and were validated during this time. Additionally, the geographical discoveries of the Age of Exploration transformed people's understanding of the world, greatly enhancing cartography. New maps not only accurately depicted newly discovered continents and oceans, but also showcased the vastness and diversity of the Earth. These maps became valuable tools for explorers, merchants, and scholars, facilitating global exchange and collaboration. In summary, The Age of Exploration was not just a period of exploration and discovery. It was a pivotal time that altered the course of world history. By breaking old patterns and establishing new connections, this era had a profound impact on global politics, economics, and culture. By delving into this period, we can better understand the formation and background of the modern world. Dear viewers, thank you for watching this episode. By learning from history, we can understand the present and foresee the future. I am your time travel guide, Lawrence Stardust. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. See you in the next episode.